So, as an example of what I'm talking about, using critical thinking and exposure to words that, again, most of us don't like hearing. Most of us do not like hearing the idea that we might have been propagandized in some fashion. So, critical thinking. Okay, so this is just a have you heard of. Have you heard of Tiananmen Square in China? Just sort of a wave at me kind of thing. About half of us, okay. The fall of the Soviet Union. Have you heard of it? Just heard about it. Okay, fall of the Soviet Union, all right. And let's give me another one. Oh, well, let's say maybe the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Who's heard of that? Back in the 70s, I know it was like 50 years ago, 45 years ago, right? We've heard of these things. This is why about half the class has heard of these things, right? And in each of these cases, there were, Tiananmen Square, the Chinese, right, shot like over 200 student protesters. So that was bad. Fall of the Soviet Union. Now, interestingly enough, as a Marxist, I have to point out, while there were posturing and so forth, really nobody died. Like, they actually went, okay, the people have pushed us out and we're done. So, kind of like zero fatalities there. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, lots of people were killed, but what's the part two of this one? Who's heard of the Taliban? Okay. Yeah, see, we funded this guys to fight these guys, and then later these guys decided they were going to fight us. So that was an oopsie. Right, but I mean, is that really phrased that way as you've learned history? Let me flip it around. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Battle of Blair Mountain. Okay, we got one person that's heard of Battle of Blair Mountain. Very cool. The Ludlow Massacre. Two people have heard of the Ludlow Massacre. Very cool. General Smedley Butler. Yeah, that one's a little bit more obscure. That's a 0 on that one. And let's go ahead. Let's go local. Local is fun. Sometimes it's called the Waco horror or the Waco lynching. Who's heard of that one? 4 people. Okay, very good. But still, though, basically, this one only gets half the class. All right, so half the class had heard of all of these, less here. So, as somebody that goes, are we potentially given a view of propagandized history? Well, let's take a look. Battle of Blair Mountain. This is the term where the term redneck starts. Miners wore red bandanas to picket, to protest, to fight against the company towns in the mountains in West Virginia. The National Guard was pulled out, as well as private security people that used machine guns and actually aircraft dropping bombs on them. So American soldier National Guard people dropping bombs on Americans. Yes, sir?
That was the first time enemies ever dropped bombs on American soil. It was not Pearl Harbor, it was Blair Mountain.
Blair Mountain. But of course, if I don't learn that, right, then when I hear that perhaps troops or people could be used against regular people, you go, well, that couldn't possibly happen. That only happens in these places. The Ludlow Massacre, even more pointed. In Colorado, miners are protesting, and the National Guard puts machine guns on a train, driving it by the camp, killing 39 people, 19 of which I believe were children. Shot them, men, women, and children, unarmed in a camp. General Smedley Butler is an interesting character in that he was Henry Ford Prescott Bush, that's Granddaddy Bush, tried to basically start a coup to take out FDR. You don't have to believe me, you can look this up. General Smedley Butler, who was then the sort of highest ranking general of the Marines, was asked to be the leader of this military coup. Now he said no and turned evidence, but the Congress decided not to look into that. The Waco Horror, for those of you that don't know, a man was accused of raping his white employer's wife. He was convicted, but a mob grabs him out of the courthouse. Roughly 10,000 people parade him through the streets before he is hung up, castrated, stabbed. His fingers were cut because he had been set on fire. He would climb up the rope. They'd set a fire below him, and he would try to climb up the rope. So they cut his fingers off. And of course, that's a terrible story, but if we haven't heard of that, or what happened in Tulsa, or for that matter, what happened in Houston in 1917, where soldiers were actually executed by the government for participating in black soldiers that didn't want the local sheriff to rough them up anymore when they got guns. They said no, and then the Army came in, and you could actually visit their graves in Sam Houston Cemetery, which is in San Antonio. That's where they're buried. They were executed. That's a different history, right? But if you haven't heard this one, but you have heard that one, critical thinking. Maybe I'm not getting the whole story. And again, I don't want you to believe any of these one tools. I want you to be able to use them to go, well, let's see. These two were definitely mostly about white people, but they were white poor people. This was about the whole country where the rich decided that FDR was potentially a threat to their profits. And this one was clearly, as was Tulsa and Houston, clearly a racial-based one. So when people say, well, why do we got to keep talking about race? That's all been fixed. Maybe not. Don't know. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to think critically about these things. How are we going to think critically about it? Well, again, like I said, I'm going to talk more specifically about, sorry, I'm going to do this, our methods, but in chapter 2, we're going to use aspects of the scientific method, which is page 37 in your book. You ask questions, you get research, you formulate a hypothesis, you do a study, you draw conclusions, you report results. That's, maybe you learned it as the wheel of science in 8th grade. Fairly dry and uninspiring, but why do we favor this versus I just really believe? Well, we in science and in sociology say, I just really believe isn't enough. Because we've just really believed lots of things. And we've even used science to screw with it about. All right, so here's an example. I'm going to do this. Anybody ever watch Simpsons? Simpsons. Yeah. So Stephen Gould from Harvard was featured on The Simpsons, one of the only sort of anthropologist, sociologist type people to ever be in. And he wrote this great book called The Mismeasure of Man. And in this book, he catalogs all the ways in which we've used pseudoscience to kind of mess people up. So, examples. Well, let's see if we can do it right here. It's 1600. Follow me along. The bigger your head, the bigger your brain. The bigger your brain, the smarter you. Look at that. It's elegant. And it just so happens the people asking that question are Northern Europeans. You know what Northern Europeans tend to have? Now, some of the female participants in the class today look a little quizzical. Let me see how it worked out for you guys. Who's got bigger heads, men or women? Come on, you little-headed people. You know the answer. Just shout it out when you know it. Men. So we couldn't let you own property or vote or do anything with your little old heads. We had to make sure that we were in charge. It's just science. Yeah. Now some people say, so that we should reject all science. No. That's why you have to have science that's both repeatable, but also what's called provable. Just because I can repeat an experiment doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Right? Because it could be based on broken assumptions, like the bigger your head, the bigger your brain, the bigger the brain, the smarter you are. By the way, who ethnically on the planet had some of the smallest heads in the world? Asian people. Anthropologists refer to them as mongoloids. Mongoloidism, referring to mental retardation, was supposed to be a condition where you weren't able to think correctly because of your head. Now, obviously, considering China predates European civilization by a good 700 years, you would think that we would have the presence of mind not to make those kind of asinine things, but we do. And we turn to pseudoscience. So not only do you have to keep asking questions, sometimes you have to keep asking questions even when you think the question has been solved. It has to be repeated. It has to make sure that the assumptions are true. How do we go about that? Well, I wish I could tell you that it was some kind of fantastic and amazing, fun way to do it, but it's not. So we're going to talk about some boring things. You have to have what's called an independent variable and a dependent variable. What does that mean? This thing causes that thing to change. That's how you make an experiment. So let's go with race, right? And income. So who earns more money in the United States, white people or black people? White people, right? So the independent variable, race, causes a change in the income. And you can usually check if you're right by going backwards through the thing and if it doesn't make any sense. So if I earn more money, will I become white? No, that doesn't make any sense. We don't do that. That doesn't make. You can also do this for gender. Who makes more money, men or women? Men. And again, if I earn more money, will I become a man or a woman? No, that doesn't make any sense. And you go, well, that's pretty simple. Geez, why isn't that always done? Well, sometimes it gets a little bit more difficult to understand. For instance, you can do education both ways. If I earn more education, I tend to earn more money. But if I have more money in my family, I also tend to get more education. So how you draw the arrow, believe it or not, is really, really important. And unfortunately, one of the things that the scientific method doesn't seem to, let's say, lend any credence to are things like horoscopes, the IQ test. Usually people in college get real mad when I put that up there because you're in college, you probably took one. You were like, oh man, it said I was really smart. You are. You're really smart. Here you are in college. But the fact is the IQ test was actually invented by a guy named Stanford Binet, and he was really actually trying to look at the functioning of people with mental retardation. It was never designed to see how smart you are. It was basically to figure out gradations of mental functioning among folks that suffered from mental retardation. But of course, we used it. Back to this propaganda thing. How did we use it? Well, we took the IQ test and we limited immigration. We used it to enforce segregation throughout the Midwest and the South. So let's say you are a rural African American child of the age of 10 in, Alabama? Let's pick on Alabama. Well, no, let's pick on Georgia. I already picked on Alabama. You're in Georgia, and I give you a test, and you don't do very well. I mean, forget the fact that half the year you're actually working in the fields, and your school is like one of those one-room jobbers. And then I give white kids the same test, and they crush it. And I go, see, no reason to spend money on these rural black children. They're clearly not ever going to be able to come up to snuff. So, we want to be careful to see how science is composed, continuing asking questions, seeing how it's also used, kind of important. Let's do, okay. So as an example, does the presence of affordable housing affect the homeless rate? Yes and no. In the short term, yes, if there's more housing, there's less homeless. But then people tend to move where there's affordable housing. Because the problem with sociology is that we're not in a laboratory all kept in little beakers, right? We move around, we change things, we change our behaviors based on things. Does the presence of police equate to crime? No, not really. We can increase police patrols, doesn't seem to really affect the crime rate any. We do know some things. I can take a neighborhood, right? And if I put a bunch of cops in that neighborhood, but that might also sound a little kind of like this thing here, you know, if I put a lot of surveillance and police around, people will watch their P's and Q's. But that's not really sustainable, right? People say, well, so what are you saying? We shouldn't have cops? You use your thinking about that, but when people say we need cops to stop crime, that's not understanding what cops do. Cops react to crime. That's the design of their job. I'm not picking on them. That's just the design of the job. You've been robbed and I show up to take your statement. I'm really not there stopping them from robbing you. Now, people say, oh, but the police presence will tend to, make them watch their P's and Q's. Having lived in New Orleans, I can tell you, not so much. People see the cop roll by, and then they start doing whatever it was they were doing before. Here's a great one. Does lighting in a school or a factory affect productivity? So this is something. Now, for those of you going to do business, here's your $1 million idea. I'm giving it to you for free. It's called the Hawthorne effect. A guy named Hawthorne thought lighting would affect productivity, so he got his little clipboard. He watched people do their thing in a factory floor, and he would dim the lights, and no matter how much he got it dark in there, people were working like crazy wild weasels, and he could not figure it out because lighting was supposed to affect it. But what he found out was the Hawthorne effect is people react to being studied. Because when he did something called a post-test, he goes, so why were you guys working so hard? Oh man, you wouldn't believe it. There was this creepy guy with a lab coat in the back of the shop watching everything we did. We all knew we were going to get fired, so we worked like crazed weasels. The lighting had nothing to do with it, right? It was the being observed.